Hello, Buzzkillers. It's the old professor here, busting myths, taking names, talking about history, talking about all kinds of things related to history. And very fortunately for you, we have on the line with us over the internets from Massachusetts, Simon Winchester, one of the most famous intellectual authors in this century and in the previous century, who's written many books that many of you have read. I've especially loved his books about the Oxford English Dictionary, The Professor and the Madman, things like that. But of course, there are so many more, and we're going to have them on the blog post. But what we want to talk about today is your new book, Knowing What We Know, Ancient Wisdom to Modern Magic. So, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It is a delight. Thank you for having me.
You know, this is so important because everyone is starting to believe, it seems to me, or maybe they've always believed, that this is sort of very, very natural. That knowledge is acquired in natural ways, that it's handed down by elders, or we learn, as you point out early in the book, that we learn what a bee sting is like by experiencing it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you show throughout the book that it's really a question of the accumulation of knowledge, of storing that knowledge, and then transmitting it in all sorts of different ways. And it isn't as orderly as you might think. It isn't just parents reading bedtime stories to children and then children, inculcating things at school and later passing that stuff on. It's much, much more complicated.
Indeed it is. And it begins with the very obvious things, like without you being taught things by your parents first, of course, and then your peers and your teachers and so on and so forth. It's by experiencing things, experiencing hunger. You learn that to satiate hunger, you eat something. If something is cold, you wrap up or get away from the source of cold. You don't touch hot plates because you'll burn yourself. And that I think is a given. But what I've tried to do in the book is to weave my way through the myriad ways in which knowledge is passed from a person to another. And then, of course, you get into and I've tried to, in this book, not too much use the word epistemology, because I think it turns people off because it's a horribly complicated word. But
epistemology being the study of knowledge.
The study of knowledge.
How knowledge is gained.
But then we do indeed have to know the different types of knowledge, not knowledge acquisition, but knowledge what, knowledge how, knowledge why. And whole schools of thought are devoted to defining knowledge. And I think perhaps, if it's all right with you, we perhaps should start with what is knowledge and who first defined it. Then you've got this group of Greek philosophers, and I'm going to leave for the time being the notion of whether the origination of knowledge in the East is very different from the knowledge that we're accustomed to in the West. That's a whole other can of worms. And with my wife being Japanese American, she's very keen indeed that I give due credit to the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and so on and so forth. And I try to. But the big three, in the order of their lives, were Socrates, Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. And it was Plato, really, above all, who attempted to define what knowledge is. And the famous or infamous trinity of words that he came up with is knowledge is justified, true belief.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can summarize this, and I think the way I did it slightly eccentrically in the book, was to say that, pointing at something in the distance, is a camel. Now, they did have camels in Greece, believe it or not, because after all, they ran Egypt. So a lot of them were brought over in presumably rather large boats across the Mediterranean. So that is a camel. Well, it may or may not be a camel, but that was the assertion. But it hasn't yet become knowledge because, as Plato would put it, you need to honestly and truthfully believe that that is a camel. You could arbitrarily point to a dog and say that's a camel, but in your heart, you know you're not being honest with yourself.
Right.
So you have to believe it's a camel. So that's the second stage. First, you state it's a camel. Then you put your hand on your heart and say, I honestly believe it's a camel. But that's not quite good enough. What you need to do is to justify it's a camel. And then that's the crucial thing, because you have to produce or have shown to you evidence that it's a camel. And so you have pictures of camels. You have other people saying, yeah, that's a camel. And gradually you build in your mind the assertion that what you believe to be true and what you've stated to be true is true. Once those three criteria, once those three boxes are ticked, then that is a camel and that is a piece of knowledge. I know it's a cumbersome way of explaining it, but I think we all need to begin this romp through the history of knowledge transmission by accepting what we think knowledge to be. Philosophers have, and conferences aplenty, are devoted to a more detailed study of this, but justified true belief seems to me, as it seemed to Plato, to be what knowledge is.
Yes, and I think it's important for people to consider all three of those things, that, as you quite rightly point out in the book, that, you can't just think that belief is knowledge, that something that's justified is knowledge, that something that's true is knowledge. It has to be the interplay of those three elements, which are the three legs to the stool.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that particularly in the United States, where, and if I'm critical of the United States, I do so because I'm an American now. I mean, I may have a funny accent, but so I'm talking about my country. And the number of people, the percentage of people that believe, for instance, the Earth to have been created on the 25th of October, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning, a huge number of people believe that to be true.
Yes.
But that does not satisfy Plato's criteria. You can say that arbitrarily, and you can believe it.
Yes.
If you're a lunatic, but to justify it, you've got to produce evidence. And the geological evidence is overwhelmingly, no, this is not true at all. So it's not knowledge, it's belief. And the difference between knowledge and belief, of course, is crucial, and particularly crucial, whereas in this country, and to a very large extent, a sufficient number of people are running things, governing us, who believe nonsense. And that's a trouble. That's a problem.
Yes, it's a problem, and it's been a problem. And now we're getting to the point which I never thought would happen in my lifetime. I have the sort of Whiggish view that things are going to get better, or generally get better. Human progress is a real thing. That progress was going to happen, but it seems to be getting worse, much worse. We had Dr. Martin Puckner on recently from Harvard talking about his book on culture, and one of the central elements of what his definition of culture is that it's something that has to be stored. Once it leaves the imagination, once it leaves the brain, it has to be put somewhere from where then it can be transmitted. And I thought a lot about that when I was reading your book, because, an awful lot of what you discuss about the transmission of knowledge starts actually with the storage of knowledge. The storage of knowledge in permanent, or in some cases semi-permanent, forms. What were some of the things that were new to you as you worked through that question?
Well, first of all, where in the brain do we store it? It was all new to me, and I probably have forgotten the Latin words of the various parts, but basically the frontal cortex of the brain, temporarily stored in parts towards the back of the head and certain aspects to the left and the right. But the principal area of storage is the frontal cortex, where the long-term memory and storage resides. But then, of course, as you get older, it starts to disappear and dissipate. What about storage, though? And I think this is very important in the modern world. Storage is not in your head, but in things that are easily accessible. And that's been something that I've been very interested in. Obviously, the library is where knowledge is stored.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at the development of the library from ancient times, particularly in Mesopotamia. I mean, I found this absolutely fascinating, the libraries that were discovered south of places like Baghdad now, and Mosul, wrecked by the ISIS people. And yet that has been a place where knowledge has been stored for the convenience of local people for thousands upon thousands of years. And then you get the great library of Alexandria and places like that. And then the huge, magnificent libraries today, New York Public Library being my particular favorite, which is just down the road from where I live. But then these rather bizarre things, and I mean, I hope I'm not diverting too much from what you want to talk about, but this extraordinary collection that was made in the 1890s by a couple of Belgians, one of them being a Nobel Prize winner, philosopher, who set up an enormous file cabinet in which they wanted every piece of knowledge in the world. Basically, it was a sort of clippings catalogue. They called it the Mundaneum. And they developed a classification system, which was far better in their view than the Dewey Decimal System. And until the 1920s, it flourished. You could ring them up and they would look at these millions upon millions of file cards and they'd find out what you wanted to know for, I think it was like 26 Belgian francs or something, and they would tell you what you wanted to know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, if you like, an early Wikipedia, and that's the thing that dominates our storage of knowledge today. It's interesting, is it not? I mean, I look at encyclopedias and compare the number of entries in the greatest of all the Britannicas, which I think most would agree was the greatest of all English language encyclopedias, contains 40,000 essays, major essays on things and people and places and concepts and so forth.
This is the 1911 one.
Yeah, the 1911. It existed until the 1930s and 40s. I mean, some of it is appallingly bad and racist and, displays how our knowledge has changed, or perception anyway, over the years. But compare that 40,000, which is a pretty sizable number, to the current number of entries in Wikipedia, which is something like 7 billion entries.
Yes.
And that brings, I think, an interesting point, which you may wish to explore, which is, we go back to these Greeks. I mean, let's say Herodotus, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, the sextet, if you like. These were the people that defined knowledge, that defined early arithmetic, mathematics, and geometry, and so forth, philosophy, ethics, and so forth. Yet compared to our better, finer thinkers today, Bertrand Russell, Richard Feynman, all sorts of people that you could say were polymaths, they knew much less. I mean, their minds cluttered with having to know the capital of South Dakota, or the languages spoken in Greenland, or what the far side of the moon looked like. But we're full of this stuff. There's so much knowledge swirling around in our heads, which makes me wonder, and this may be a heresy, that all these devices which have been invented since the 1960s to take the strain off the brain, if you like, it started with the Texas Instruments electronic calculator in 1967, which at an instant said, you don't need to calculate anything anymore. And you needn't know how arithmetic works. I mean, the slide rule and the abacus, you had to know some mathematical processes, but this little bone ivory colored plastic box, you just touched things and out come a number. You didn't know how it eventuated, but so your brain didn't have to do that work. And then the spell checker and the grammar checker, and then Google. So everything is accessible instantly. We don't have to think. And people say, oh, this is terrible. If we don't need to think, we're going to stop thinking. The brain's going to atrophy in the same way that the human body is atrophying because we don't do exercise. I mean, some people do, but most people don't. And so as goes the human body, therefore there goes the human mind. And I must say, I'm thinking about this after I wrote the book, and massively, I put this in a few pages at the very end of the book. I wonder if it's the other way around, that what these machines are doing is actually allowing us to remove all the unnecessary information from our minds, and cleansing, purging, if you say, because you don't really need to know the capital of South Dakota or what the far side of the moon looks like. Why not reduce our minds to the same potential state as my Greek, Herodotus to Euclid type people? And then we can, if there are clever ones among us, think new and great things, because we're tabula rasa, if you like, as they were. And maybe this, therefore...
unencumbered by the details.
Well, unencumbered, exactly. Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking. So I'm sort of quite optimistic. How AI plays into this is, of course, another story, but that's, I imagine, another program for you.
What's fascinated me so much about this storage concept is that it's storage, but it's also the halfway house. It's the midpoint, but it's actually also part of the transmission process. That you go to Wikipedia to get something. Wikipedia is not just sitting there, not being used, and you extract from it. So that's transmission. So the book is really about transmission. Again, what new things did you find about transmission, and what about these new things fascinated you so that you wanted to write this great book?
Well, it's such it's a huge topic. I mean, that very that very question. I mean, what I was fascinated with the transmission of wrong knowledge, incorrect knowledge, distorted knowledge. I mean, first of all, let's deal with Wikipedia. I mean, I remember when Wikipedia started, and I was one of the skeptics who said, you know, it simply can't be trusted. And it was so often unreliable. Well, now, many years into its, when did it start? 2001 or something, so 20 odd years since Jimmy Wales and company started it, it is pretty trustworthy because everything is checked and rechecked and re-edited by the hive brain, you know, everyone that uses it. But I mean, I was happily typing away. I think I was looking at, maybe it was Doug Engelbart, the man who invented hypertext. I mean, that hypertext, able to look at a word on the computer, it's blue, you click it and you go hither and yon. But when I was just looking at his biography on Wikipedia, of course, it said that he had died. And not just died, but died on the very day that I was writing about him. And I thought, this is really bizarre. So I thought, well, that's astonishing and sinister, and perhaps I shouldn't type about people because they die the moment I type about them. But then I looked into it and posted something on Twitter, I think, which said, isn't it extraordinary, Doug, I'm not sure that it was Doug Engelbart, but it was someone like that, has died. But there's no obituary. I've looked at the New York Times, I've looked at papers that might reasonably be thought of as carry an obituary of this stellar figure. There was none. And then when I got up the next morning, there was a note from a person in New Zealand saying, no, he was killed off by some mischievous person on Wikipedia. He's not dead at all. And you may be interested to know that 9 other people died on the same day, and all of them were perfectly alive and well and kicking. So there is still an element of
right.
distrust as far as Wikipedia is concerned. You have to be wary.
Yeah, it's almost as if you have to wait for a certain period for everything to be checked. But, you know, I've been surprised as well. Maybe the one thing in the world that I'm still an expert on, the 1833 Irish Church Temporalities Act, which, of course, people are beating down my door to find out about. The Wikipedia entry, which I didn't write, is really very good. Nice and concise and full of solid facts. So whenever I fact check them about something that I know about, I'm surprised at how good things are. Sorry, that's sort of a separate question, but it's not just the hive mind, anybody chipping in and everybody chipping in. There seems to be sort of Supreme Court of Wikipedia experts.
Yes, I'm not sure that Supreme Court is quite the measure of...
No, sorry, not anymore. That's right. Yeah.
Yes, right, exactly.
Learned counsel or something. Sorry, well, back to the original sort of point in question about what new did you find out about the importance of the various cultural practices of transmission?
I'm fascinated by a chap called Edward Bernays, for instance, who was one of the early figures in the whole business of public relations. He was a cousin of Freud's. He lived in America, though, and he was a sort of important person in the, I think he assisted Woodrow Wilson on the 1918-1919 Paris peace talks. But he then decided that he would, or he could, manipulate the public mind much more easily than the public might imagine. And there are 2 classic examples, things he did that changed America. And one of them, maybe it's changed back in recent years, was persuading Americans to eat bacon and eggs for breakfast. Now, in the 1920s, people ate cereal, you know, early Kellogg's, early granola, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the ham producers, the pig farmers of America, thought, no, we've got lots of spare pigs, and they should be persuaded that that's a good way to start the day. So Bernays thought, okay, he was hired by the Beech Nut, I think it was, who make chewing gum, but apparently they were a big ham packing company. So he found a doctor in New York who was willing to say that during the night when you sleep, your energy dissipates, and you need, therefore, to have a lot of protein pumped into you when you wake up. It's essential. And the best way of getting protein was to eat bacon and eggs. And Bernays, whether he actually got in touch with people or not, we don't know. But he then got a piece in the New York Times to say that 5,000 doctors had agreed that, yes, we lose energy when we sleep, we need protein when we wake up. And so bacon and eggs are an essential component of the American breakfast. Almost overnight, that became what Americans in the 1920s, 30s, I guess there was a big hiccup during the Depression, but that's what was the default breakfast. And of course, the Beechnut Company, packing company, was delighted and paid Mr. Bernays a great deal of money. A second instance of that, the manipulation of the human mind, came with the notion that American women, once again in the 1920s, men didn't like women to smoke. And this was because the cigarette was seen as a penis, and women didn't have that kind of kit. So it was impertinent of them to put these things in their mouths. It's too complicated for my mind to process that. So Lucky Strike, whoever makes Lucky Strike, went to Bernays and said, can you fix this? So he thought about it and then said, yes, I've come up with an idea. And so during the Easter parade of, I think, 1929, it might have been 1930 in New York City, he arranged that a number of very attractive young women wearing long skirts, as I guess many of them did in those days, would secrete under their skirts, taped to their thighs, packets of Lucky Strike cigarettes. And when they got to St. Patrick's Cathedral, where they knew there would be a gaggle of photographers and reporters, the women parted their skirts, lifted them up, to everyone's excitement, of course, and reached down and took a Lucky Strike cigarette, put it between their lips, lit it, and announced, this is a torch of freedom, echoing the torch on the Statue of Liberty. It wasn't so much as, this is a penis I'm going to put in my mouth. It was, this is the suffragette. We're asserting our right for freedom, to do all sorts of things, one of them being to smoke. And everyone took photographs of this beguiling event, and cigarettes were smoked by women in vast numbers thereafter, right up to Virginia Slims and today. So the manipulation of the human mind I found fascinating. I mean, I could go on and on about this because it leads up to the famous case of Lord Haw Haw, once again an American, although he was principally most of his early life in Ireland and then came to Britain, profoundly anti-English because of the treatment of the Irish, and went over to Germany at the beginning of the Second World War. And because he had a rather nice English accented voice, Germans used him on the radio. And so he broadcast to England every night, Germany calling, Germany calling. That was what his voice was like. And they called him Lord Haw Haw in England because he sounded so ridiculous. And he would taunt the British, telling stories, most of them true as it happened, about losses and ships sunk and so on, the battles lost. Then he was, at the end of the war, he was found, captured and hanged for treason, one of the last people ever to be hanged in Britain. So all of these examples, cigarettes, bacon and eggs, propaganda, completely fascinates me about the manipulation of the mind with the dispersion of incorrect knowledge or knowledge inappropriately given.
Yes, but as you point out in the book, and as we know, so many people believe the protein story and believe the bacon and egg story, even if they're vegetarian. They feel that they feel they have to replace bacon and eggs with something else. But it was a marketing thing. I mean, I'm sure there are nutritionists now who will say it, but I mean, it's not in the American Constitution, but this is a fundamental belief. I mean, what I'm trying to say is Americans don't consider this belief, they consider it knowledge. Even though you point out, and other people have pointed out, how artificially it was constructed.
Totally. I mean, but that seeps into just cultural behavior, breakfast time behavior. But I'm fascinated by an event which, oddly enough, and I won't go into it in detail, there's a personal connection to it, but it's this business of, it's known as the Zinoviev letter. 1928, I think I got my dates right, the British elected for the first time ever a socialist prime minister called Ramsay MacDonald.
Yeah.
And there had never been ultra-left prime minister. And this shocked the old conservative out in the shires, who said this is monstrous. So they did everything possible. He had a very slim majority in Parliament to derail him. And after a number of months, 6 or 10 months or something, there was sufficient opposition to Ramsay MacDonald in Parliament that they could pass a vote of no confidence, which meant he had to go back to the country. And our system in Britain is so very different from America. And there had to be another election. So they were determined that Ramsay MacDonald, impertinent upstart, should not get back into number 10 Downing Street. So the election campaign in Britain lasts mercifully only 3 weeks, so it's short and sharp.
Yeah.
And shortly before the actual election day, a letter was received by the Foreign Office in London from a man called Zinoviev, who was in Moscow, and he was the General Secretary of Communist International, the person who, now that the Bolshevik Revolution had happened in the Soviet Union, was spreading communism all over the world and doing so in all possible manners. And he wrote this letter, which he said was for publication, and indeed it was. The Foreign Office passed it to the Daily Mail, hugely popular newspaper, and today, as it happens, the most read English language newspaper on the internet in the world. And it's still full of nonsense, as this story.
Yeah, and it certainly was then.
So the Zinoviev letter said, essentially, brothers in England, comrades in England, if you elect Ramsay MacDonald, as we think you should, then we will change England forever. It'll become a Bolshevik state. The army will revolt, we'll overthrow the monarchy, everything will be wonderful, and it'll be the Soviet Union of formerly the United Kingdom. And of course, this absolutely terrified people. They said, we don't want that. We wouldn't mind a compassionate left-wing prime minister. We don't want a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, in Britain rather. So the mood of the voters when they went to the polls was overwhelmingly against Ramsay MacDonald because it was felt that he had the full support of the Bolsheviks in Moscow. And he was roundly defeated. There wasn't to be another socialist prime minister for another 25 years. And Stanley Baldwin, a good pipe-smoking, tweed-wearing Tory, was elected to power, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and Britain was in safe hands again. Well, it turns out that the Zinoviev letter was a forgery. It was written, doesn't really matter who it was written by, a Foreign Office official, by someone working for MI5. And so the point I'm trying to make, rather clumsily, is that the distortion of information, yes, it can do relatively minor things like getting women to smoke or people to eat bacon and eggs, but it can also change governments.
Yes.
And that's, as we all know only too well in this country, to see how the national mood is changed. I mean, the whole business of the Iraq War, for instance, I mean, that hugely was the result of a campaign by a public relations company, Hill and Knowlton. I mean, I'm sure you know that story.
Mm-hmm.
So what to believe? I suppose that's one of the big problems in dealing with this topic today, is that not only what is knowledge, what is belief, but what is true. And it's...
But we're constantly having to revise that information and find out what, part of that information is true, the Zinoviev letter or the protocols of the elders of Zion, or any number of forgeries to be true. And they believe it. It's knowledge to them. And yet it takes a while for the truth to come out, things to be corrected. And yet an awful lot of damage is done in the meantime. And, sometimes, of course, I, in theory, make money on a myth-busting podcast. But I also despair that we're always too late.
Well, can I give you an example of, we've not talked too much about education, except how impressed I am about early Babylonian education.
Yeah.
My local high school here, I was sent by a parent a lesson plan, which it's full of cartoons. There's Patty the Poodle, Lenny the Labrador. They're all dogs with these silly cartoons of dogs. We're going to tell you the truth about the use of the atom bomb against, or the atom bombs against the Japanese in 1945. And we had to do it. We had to drop these bombs. And this is dogs talking to children, so sort of beguiling animals, saying we had to drop the bombs because Japan was on the verge of dominating the entire world. They were ruthless, cruel people who they were intending on invading the United States, and we had to stop them by any means.
Yeah.
And this was a 10-page assertion of this very complex problem. Because whether or not to drop atom bombs is hugely important.
Yes.
Told to 15-year-old children through the voices of cartoon dogs like Patty the Poodle. I just wanted to go down and strangle the teacher because it's so untrue. So, it plays into everything that It's a kind of Fox News, Tucker Carlson kind of thing.
Yeah.
Complex subjects are reduced to their bare bones and then, in many cases, not in all cases, thank God, distorted horribly. And that seems to me very important.
Well, speaking of distortions and myths and misunderstandings, in writing the book, what did you find were the major sort of misunderstandings about what knowledge is? Not necessarily specific examples of false information becoming, encased in a public's consciousness, but our misconceptions about how knowledge is attained and transmitted and, what it means. I mean, I think the general myth is, that there's this beautiful, perfect thing out there called knowledge, and that we are getting to it or getting closer to it, and then we eventually get to it and eventually understand it. That to me is the big myth, but I think there must be hundreds of others.
Yes, I suppose at its very basic Western societies anyway, it's how this knowledge is transmitted, not necessarily by newspapers or public relations or television and so forth, but at schools. I find, admittedly, this is slowly losing traction in this country. I think that the idea, I compare the SAT, for instance, to the Chinese, peripherally, Korean and Japanese as well, examinations called the Gaokao. The Gaokao is this terrifying examination given at about the same time in a student's personal history as the SAT is in this country. So the SAT, largely but not exclusively, is multiple choice questions, which I think are barbaric because it gives you a 25% chance of getting the right, and education shouldn't be based on chance, in my view. The Chinese one is overwhelmingly essay-based. You are encouraged to think rather than to learn by rote. As an example, I looked at two. The most recent Gaokao, for instance, has a question, and this is for 17-year-olds. Milk is generally supplied in round bottles. Mineral water, I may have got this the wrong way around, is supplied in square cartons. Wine is often in round bottles put in square boxes. Write an essay on the subtle differences between our philosophical approach to the round and the square. I thought, this is majestic. You just think, I've never heard this before. I want to think about it. When I went to university, there were 5 questions on the paper, all of them essays. Choose any 2, and you've got 3 hours. So my 2 were 2 cheers for democracy. Is 2 the right number? Great question. And is the American way of life truly exportable? This was 1965, I think it was, so long time ago. The myth is that the education systems in the West teach you to think. They don't. They teach you to learn overwhelmingly by rote, and that is not the case in China and Japan. I'm going off to China to tour for an earlier book next month, and I'm deliberately wanting to go to schools because I'm hugely impressed by the fact that these people who are our competitors or our enemies, or however you choose to look at them, are being taught how to think rather than simply to know or simply to believe. There is, of course, in China, unfortunately, this carapace, if you like, of belief in the sanctity of the Communist Party. But nonetheless, they do think. And I'm sure, I don't feel in this country thinking is encouraged as much as it should.
Well, and tests and education are all part of the transmission.
Sure.
It seems to me one of the things I'm getting, we're drifting not far afield from the book, but one of the things I think that seems to me so interesting about Western cultures, let's just take the 3 I know best, the United States, Great Britain, and Ireland, is that we're constantly thinking revising the SAT, the ACT, in Great Britain, the O-level, A-level, and whatever they have now, and Ireland, the Leaving Cert, constantly working on how to make these things better, introducing some sort of essay element, et cetera, et cetera. Almost never do we look at other cultures' examples. The SAT is the same, more or less, as it was 400 years ago when I took it.
Well, that's why I feel quite strongly, heresy though it may be, to say that we've got an awful lot to learn from China. And that famous, I'm sure, legendary remark of Zhou Enlai's about, he was foreign secretary at the time, what's your opinion about the the French Revolution, which 1789, and he said, it's too early to tell. And that's sort of
Yeah.
wisdom at work.
I have to tell you, I have to bust a myth here because we did a show on
not
that,
true.
and I did a lot of research into that. Well, he did say it, but he thought that the question had been about the 1968 Paris student revolts. Yeah.
Well, in that case, that was reasonable.
On the other hand,
yes.
it is something I can imagine a Chinese philosopher saying. And in fact, as we know, that is still too early to ultimately understand the long-term effects of the original French Revolution because we deal with it every day. We continue to deal with it every day.
Exactly. But I mean, going back to China briefly, playing the long game is what China does. And we, of course, for our own reasons, the founding fathers being to blame, thinking in terms of 4 years or 2 years, of course, and that's so damaging, I think.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
But the storage and transmission of culture, it seems to me, is a very long-term process, and we keep changing it and, in theory, improving it. I wonder whether there might be a long-term, or a way that, in general, Westerners and Americans are thinking long-term by constantly changing, rather than just having museums of knowledge or pure archives that no one goes into.
Yes, I think that's the whole question of what should we know? What do we need to know? I mean, there was the controversy, was there not, about was it Ed Hirsch? And,
yes.
Suggesting what we should know. And that is a whole can of worms opened. I believe that, and this goes back to the point I was making earlier, that an awful lot of what we do know or are encouraged to know is unnecessary.
Yes.
I'm sorry to insult the people in South Dakota, but we really don't need to know, A, that it's Pierre, and B, that it's pronounced Pierre and not Pierre. I mean, those are two utterly trivial things. But to read the great philosophers, and is there not a course? So is there not advertisements for great courses by great thinkers? We need to do more of that than just knowing things. Right. And the whole world of influencers, don't get me started. I'm sure you feel exactly the same way. So trivial, so insubstantial. I said something earlier in the book about how the difference between Chinese education and American education at the moment is that one is like Go and the other's like Go Fish.
Yes.
Go is a game that everyone should be playing, really, and to get to know.
Extremely sophisticated, very complicated, so very, very deep.
It looks so simple. Yeah, too deep for me.
Well, I happened to visit a fifth grade class recently, and they were fifth graders. They were doing state capitals, and the teacher was saying you need to know Pierre and things like that, and there were lists. But unless you live in South Dakota, or you have business with the South Dakota government, you don't need to know that.
You really don't. No, but you do know how to play Go.
Yes, you should know how to play Go, but I don't know how to play Go. It's too hard for me. But what I do know is that buzzkillers out there should get this book because, A, it really does make you think, and make you think by taking you along the history of how these things have been transmitted. And I'm learning because of you and because of Dr. Puckner and all sorts of other people. I'm going back to this idea that Babylon is so important as a knowledge center. And these are the things I've sort of let, kind of slip away and forgotten about and not appreciated. And it's your work that reminds us of it. And I'm so glad that people buy your books in great numbers and read them in great numbers, because that means that something good is happening in the publishing world. And this is a very long way of saying thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great fun and a lovely way to begin my morning.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Buzzkillers, the book is out now, and we've put it on the Buzzkill bookshelf, of course, for you to get. And we will talk to all of you out there next week.